Hello, and welcome to the Urban Tech Hub's first workshop on urban technology from Cornell Tech. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you are. I'm really thrilled to be kicking off one of our first public events that's launching the Urban Tech Hub here at Cornell Tech and the Jacobs Institute. I'm really happy that you're all here to help guide us in our conversation about what's next for urban tech. You might be asking, what is a hub in the first place? Well, very quickly, a hub is embedded here at Cornell Tech as part of the Jacobs Institute. We already have two that launched with the university a couple of years ago in health tech and in connective media. And this newest hub on urban technology is launching this year. And I'm really thrilled to have you come and join us. A hub is really a bridge between the academic resources that a university has and the needs of the public sector and the private sector when it comes to the growing tensions between the challenges in cities and the needs of communities. What we're going to do at the Urban Tech Hub is address these urban challenges. And there have been perhaps never more challenging times than we're facing today, particularly with regard to the perceived nexus between density and COVID and the fact that cities in many ways are being blamed for the pandemic. But we are big fans of cities, obviously, and big defenders of density and thinking about how technology can actually provide solutions to help make people feel safer in cities and help address some of these problems. But there are larger problems as we see it. In many ways, technology and industry moves too fast. It's hard for cities to keep a pace. Oftentimes, cities are too slow to absorb some of the technological changes. There's been a real perceived embrace of disruption. Disruption can be great when it comes to industry, but not so great when it comes to your personal life. So we're going to be thinking about not just challenges from the top down, but also the bottom up, engaging communities directly and coming up with solutions. Because at Cornell Tech, a main tenet of our belief and a foundation of what separates us in many ways is putting people first. It doesn't mean that technology isn't important, but the user experience, the user is central to what we believe in. And in many ways, we're building upon the strengths of Cornell Tech and Jacobs as leaders in HCI, human-computer interaction, privacy concerns, and these are going to be some of the foundational components of how we view the challenges of urban technology. The hub has three pillars. One, as part of Cornell Tech's mission, is help diversify the city's industrial base and helping to add and support a tech ecosystem that really has been growing at an astounding rate, certainly pre-pandemic. We're also going to be applying research. We're not just going to be writing papers and talking to ourselves. We're going to be talking to you, and we're going to be engaging the public directly. And maybe most importantly, we're going to be engaging the tech ecosystem, building strong partnerships between the academic institution here at Cornell Tech and our industry and government partners. I couldn't be more thrilled to hand this over to Anthony Townsend. We're really lucky, and I'm very grateful that Anthony agreed to join us here at the Urban Tech Hub as our first Urbanist in Residence. From his first book in 2013 on smart cities to his latest book on Ghost Road, looking at the impacts of automated vehicles on cities and built environments, he has been a leading voice in the impacts of technology on our built environment. Anthony is going to be leading our research efforts and also curating a year-long series of events. I'm not going to take Anthony's thunder. He's going to talk more about what this series is about, but I want to give you a bit of a genesis of the title. We very much didn't believe that we have all the solutions by any means to the challenges that cities have and the role that technology has played. So we very consciously have titled this series, What is Next for Urban Tech? Because we believe there's no better way to address problems and to start with the right question. So with that, Anthony, I'm going to leave it to you, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for opening the session and for kicking off the series. I want to start by just explaining how I see the opportunity both for my year as an Urbanist in Residence and for this series in particular. I'm going to share my screen quickly. I think if we look all around us, it's very clear that cities are rebooting. After the pandemic struck, we all expected that reopening cities would be much harder than it was to shut them down. But I think very few of us appreciated just how challenging it would be. New York City, where many of us live and work, is going through a period where many of our services are still severely disrupted. Transit, housing, schools, retailing, tourism, and office space. And it's clear that even if things start to recover, that we're not going back to the old normal, and we probably shouldn't either. The virus exposed really striking inequalities in large cities like ours and others. Migrants, racial and ethnic minorities, the poor, women, and the elderly were all hit very, very hard by the virus. We've heard calls for dismantling the biases and the blockages that created so much of that isolation and vulnerability. And so you might say that city governments actually need a reboot, running a new batch of code, whether that's legal code or actual computer code. This is a big task. And part of that task creates an opening for urban tech, although it's much bigger than just technology. The problem is that urban tech is itself also in the process, like my presentation, which is advanced here, of rebooting. We've all been through the last 10 years of seeing our urban lives completely transformed, the way we live, the way we work, the way we play by technology. And a lot of it has been about using technology to boost the intensity of cities, to make cities more urban. Whether it's squeezing more people into the same amount of office space, more beds into the same apartments, short-term apartments, or more events into the same number of venues. But now a lot of those dreams are on hold. We're using technology to flee cities rather than to flock to them. And the toxic fallout of what has been called surveillance capitalism, this gold rush to cash in on the sensors and the supercomputers that we carry around in our pockets, that's still being calculated. I think there's a consensus that technology will play a role in building better cities for the future. We have to be well informed and well connected to deal with our shared problems. But the next generation of urban technology has to have a more solid ethical foundation so that it doesn't make our problems worse. And so as we launch the Urban Tech Hub, this fall's forum is really our opportunity to ask these hard questions. What is urban tech? What are its core challenges, assumptions, aims, and methods? Who isn't contributing to the development of urban tech? And does this in fact hold us back, creating barriers to access, unequal benefits, and ethical dilemmas? And how can we think more systematically about the future of urban tech? What are the trends that should drive our research agenda, the capacities we build, and the collaborations that we create? And starting in December and moving into the spring, we're going to start to dig into some of the more specific challenges like Michael asked about the built environment and density and some of the specific technologies that come into play when we start to tackle these problems. And this brings us to the topic for today, embracing austerity. How will cities innovate with less? I think that everyone here is probably aware of the uncertainty that's hanging over state and city finances right now, given Congress's inability to pass a relief package this fall. We're also aware that New York City faces a particularly dire situation, but this is a national and to some extent international problem as well. We've heard about job cuts and service cuts, but what you might not be aware of is that this is having an impact on long-term investments in infrastructure and innovation as well. And urban tech projects are often the first to go on the chopping block. If you look at some of the numbers here from National League of Cities survey, this was in June. The situation has worsened considerably since then. $360 billion in revenue losses projected just over the next 3 years, just in the United States. 74% of municipalities reported that they've already started making cuts. 65% of the cities reported that they're delaying or completely canceling capital expenditures in infrastructure projects. Now, a lot of these are unavoidable, but it doesn't have to mean that cities stop moving forward. European cities went through some severe rounds of austerity over the last decade, but many of them have been able to push forward an innovation agenda and a tech-driven innovation agenda. Social entrepreneurs are now a force to be reckoned with that can deliver real tech innovation and real capacity to help serve people. But how do cities tap that? What can we learn? And is there any hope at all? Our guide for this exploration is Sascha Haselmayer, founder and CEO of Citymart, and a public interest technology fellow at the New America Foundation. And Sascha has been a friend of mine for many years. Recently, as part of his fellowship, Sascha has been sharing his insights on the impacts of the pandemic on municipal government finance and innovation at the Embracing Austerity blog. And I think it's a really great source of provocative thinking about what has come before, what could come in the future, and ways that cities are going to have to really get scrappy if they're going to continue to deliver innovation and tech-driven innovation going forward. So if I could welcome Sascha into the conversation. Let's see, we're going to have to unmute you. And
woohoo.
We're still getting the hang of these Zoom stage buttons. Are you there? Hi, Sascha.
Hi, Anthony. Great to
Welcome. Yeah, good to have you here. So with all that, I want to get started by talking about procurement, which is really what you've been working on for the last 10 years. And that's about when I met you 10 years ago. And that's when I was starting to get interested in smart cities and urban tech. And I think what you explained to me then, and you've been explaining for a long time, is figuring out how to find and actually buy an innovative solution or innovative technology solution for city government is actually often harder than inventing it in the first place. Can you explain this one more time for our group here, and tell me if that's a fair characterization?
Yeah. So maybe to start with, city procurement is worth about 10% of GDP, so $4.5 trillion a year. It's really, really, really big. It's like some of the very biggest economic sectors or industries we know. In that context, I think it's also important to think about that at least 90% of our public services are outdated by 10 years, I would say probably 20 years, which means we're overspending significantly for getting comparatively poor outcomes. So there is plenty of money that allow us to create public value, and in turn, there's really little reason why meaningful urban tech should not have a big opportunity. But in 2019, there were in total 250 municipal urban tech related procurements in the whole of the US. It's still, the number of transactions is very, very low. Now, if you're inside government, the challenge of finding an innovation starts with people not even thinking about that they might need an innovation. I like to kind of like, cities are really good at buying traffic signals, and someone will publish a procurement for 50 traffic signals, and they barely take a moment to think about, is there a better way to make a street crossing safer? Is there maybe something they would consider an innovation, meaning it hasn't been on their radar? And what we found is that people just know 3% of what's out there. So even the best informed people just have no real perspective on all the different ways they can achieve their outcomes. Now, what has changed over the past 10 years, 10 years ago, I would have said to you that anywhere in the world it is difficult. What has happened over the last 10 years is that the US stayed where it was 10 years ago when it comes to municipal procurement. And the UK just took a massive leap forward, which we will maybe talk about later. But you have really, really sophisticated buyers in the UK. And part of it is that they created a new function in government called commissioners. So these are people who are responsible for a public service. So they kind of carry a portfolio of public services they're in charge of, and their job is to constantly find better ways of delivering them. And these guys are like your innovation detectives in procurement. They're the ones you can call. They're the ones that know how to evaluate and compare options. Now, another thing, another strange thing is happening in the US in particular around procuring innovation, is that the market has segmented into what we call the below threshold procurement, so contracts that are worth less than $10,000. And then there's the really high value stuff, and there's nothing really happening in between. And the $10,000 model is where most venture capitalists are pushing urban tech startups. And that's where you get these really aggressive sales teams pitching to thousands and thousands of local governments, usually focusing on small municipalities because there are more of them. There are very few cities, only 10 cities, that are big in the US. And that's also led to a distortion of the market, where governments tend to buy more. Even though we have a rapid rise of social problems, governments tend to buy 20 times more untested venture-backed technologies as compared to meaningful social innovations.
Sorry, Sasha, can I clarify? So they're targeting the sub $10,000 procurements because they don't go through the bidding process,
or very, very big deals, but there's nothing in between. And so you get this this convenience procurement situation where people buy something that is easy and seems to be like make your life easier as a public manager, but they're not really urban technologies that kind of are really changing the way you do something. Mm-hmm. And there's an interesting study about how people avoid, there are a lot of incentives in procurement to not appreciate complexity. So when you're buying something that in principle is a complex issue, all the incentives are pulling the buyers towards making that a simple transaction. And I think we're certainly struggling with these kind of behaviors. How do we begin to shake people out of their preconceptions on what is easy, what is meaningful, and when we're saying it's hard for someone to buy something innovative today, I think in part it is knowing what's out there, and in part it's just the cards are really stacked against them. The organizations, nothing is encouraging them to really move ahead and do what we would all consider to be the right thing.
So, I mean, the reason I wanted to talk about this is that I think before urban tech innovators, go to build a solution, it's absolutely vital that they understand who their customer is, right? And what their customer needs. When the customer is a city government, what can you say about the constraints that they're operating under? So you mentioned this fact that they're sort of looking to kind of transactionalize the procurements. What other kinds of constraints are they operating under that really shape the way urban tech innovators have to respond? And are there opportunities for them to sort of push back on that and get more creative?
Yeah, there is kind of, there are really big differences among the sizes of the cities. So in the US, innovation in procurement is really 5 cities that are aggregating almost all the action that is going on, and then you have smaller cities like Boston who per capita are outperforming cities like New York City by a mile, but New York City, because it is so large, is buying just about the same number of innovations as Boston is. So the environment is very different in terms of like the density of innovation that is happening. There are big national differences. In the UK, you have these really sophisticated buyers that will really appreciate added value you bring, but also interrogate a technology to a much greater extent. But their budgets have pre-COVID been cut by 50% over the last 10 years, and now they're down already by another 20% at least. So there's simply no money. But you have an open door if you can demonstrate that you're achieving the outcomes. In smaller cities in the US, you quickly get to a place where just the competence and capacity to understand sophisticated models or impact models or transitioning out of one way of doing things to another are becoming much greater challenges. So those are things on their minds. But very often it is like finding a needle in the haystack, right? So there's always going to be a handful of cities that need exactly and are looking for exactly what you're offering. It's just how are they going to find you, or even worse, how are you going to find them out of tens of thousands of municipalities? How are you going to find the one that is currently thinking about solving that problem? So, and I think that's a recurring problem, that we don't get a lot of foresight. We don't get a lot of like knowing what is coming next. And so we always have to speculate using other data points.
So for instance, if I develop a brand new sensor solution that can detect some novel type of air pollution that has a terrible impact on young children, what is the process by which I go about, finding city governments that might want to buy that?
Yeah, so I think one is of course to find the places with the worst pollution and health incidents, and to actually find the communities most in need. That doesn't mean that the government has prioritized that problem, but at least you have a very strong argument. In that case also, I think government is just one of the possible funders, and it may be easier to kind of bridge the time until you get the government as a customer through other partnerships with local philanthropy or foundation or healthcare providers. I think the other thing is that we found, and that very few companies do, is building a real constituency around your offering, actually creating public demand for what you're bringing to the table. And we know from inside government that people are it really helps them. If you're inside government and you want to do the right things, and local newspapers and people are asking for it, it's much, much easier to kind of push that through. So I think those are some of the tactics. I think you can then do what ends up happening with most startups. You can say, if I sell this below $10,000, I can maybe sign a deal in 6 months, if I find that community and if they're willing to. If I'm above $10,000, it may take me a year or 2 or 3 years, or they may threaten me, like I was threatened by a major transit authority in the US at one point. They said, if you don't sell to us below $10,000, we will never make an effort to procure it. And I think that's what startups are hearing all the time. Mm-hmm. So I think being prepared for having a strategy and being prepared as to what your journey is going to be is super important. And I think far too few, and we've seen it with like Uber and Lyft and so forth, right? With the ride-hail wars, how successful they are at mobilizing communities, and how hard it becomes for governments to ignore technology when it comes with a vested interest like that.
So I wanted to put up a chart from something that you published last year, which was really stunning because I think it showed just how much variation there is, at least among US cities, in their ability to engage with these kinds of small innovation providers. What went into this study, and what were the results?
Yeah, so we did two things in the study. One thing was we read every single procurement published by municipalities in the US. I think we read over 100,000 procurements. Mm-hmm. And another thing we said, okay, let's go to the homepage of the city and see how hard it is to see an actual procurement. And what I mean by that is not just to see that it exists, but to see the document. Because what we found for companies that don't regularly do business with government, you really need to quickly get to the document. Let's say the city is procuring a smart waste bin system, you need to quickly see that document to see whether this is an opportunity for you. And so what we found in a city like Atlanta, you need 3 clicks to do that. In San Mateo County, there is actually a private company operating the procurement portal that chooses which vendors are allowed in or not. So for example, they don't allow us access to the procurement portal because they think we might be a competitor. So the public data is not even accessible in some cases at all. And so what we found is that there are all kinds of, this chart is really the simple barriers that really any city can solve within 3 days. Like, how hard is it to get there? Is there a link on your homepage to get there? Do you have a paywall? Do you need to provide a lot of corporate information to get access to opportunities? So it really focuses on how quickly you can get to the information. And it's been quite impactful. So Atlanta went from being ranked 67th in the country to being the top ranked city within 3 months. You know, they took this, they kind of turned around their system with a new procurement, head of procurement. And we're finding that's kind of like the very basic end of just making things easy to find. If you take a city like Baltimore, less than 1% of businesses in the Baltimore area are registered for public procurement notifications. And yet the city spends 10% of GDP. So it seems there's a long way we need to go to kind of make sure that people who don't know anything about selling to government can see all those opportunities that are there.
So, I mean, it seems clear that you've been at this for 10 years. You know, the world has been turned upside down. A great deal of the, you know, wind behind city sales in terms of funding, like any kind of discretionary projects has been taken away. And they already had numerous challenges in doing anything innovative, you know, to begin with. So now there's no money. Do we embrace austerity, as you've put it? A lot of people would look at that and say austerity isn't something you want to embrace; it's something you want to run away from or fight back against. Yeah. Why should we embrace it, and what does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah. So when I called this embracing austerity, it was really born out of a concern that in the US in particular, as we were starting to see COVID bite, a lot of city leaders spent their time lobbying the federal government for bailouts. And they were talking about when we get our bailout later in the summer. And so they were losing valuable time. They were not preparing themselves. They were kind of hoping for a bigger outcome. And that's exactly what Greece did when the financial austerity hit Europe. They kind of focused so much on the big European political story that they missed out for 7 years taking local action to come to terms with a new reality. I'm really inspired by what happened in the UK as an example, where Prime Minister Cameron very early on said, you know, austerity is not something I want to do. It's a necessity. It's going to be with us for a long time. And let's make the best of it. And it was a clear instruction to the whole country that they were facing budget cuts, that they would need to find new ways of delivering services, and they would get support in transitioning if they have good ideas. A lot of emphasis was put nationally on the non-governmental sector, on the nonprofit and private sector. It became very open to small business. So it became an attitude of saying, this is not just a blip on our radar. This is not just going to go away in 3 months or 6 months or a year. This is here to stay. And the only way that we're going to be resilient is by finding our most effective way of operating. And I think that's, so it's become a kind of, and COVID is in a way the perfect resilience scenario, right? It's kind of like 3 crises hitting you at once. And I think the idea of just hanging in there for a year and then going back to normal is very dangerous. because it doesn't prepare you for this being an extended crisis. It doesn't prepare you for other setbacks or other shocks and stresses that might hit you.
So you wrote quite a bit about the experience of Wigan, which is a sort of working class city on the outskirts of Manchester that had a pretty stunning 25% cut in its allotment from the national government in the UK, I guess around 2010 during the big first austerity round. How did they manage to haul themselves out of it? And what was the transformation in government that happened there?
Yeah, so I think the thing they did quickly was, after they called the first 2 years salami slicing. They were just cutting bits and pieces of the budget to kind of hang in there. And then they realized that this would go on for at least another 5 years. And they actually took on a much bigger project to make bigger cuts so that they could, first of all, find places where they were hoping to get cuts and maybe the cuts wouldn't work, that they could invest in making those cuts. So rather than jumping straight into cutting things, they could make some upfront investments to transition services from one model to another. And a really important part was that they said, we're no longer able as a government to sit on top of the community and serve them and kind of deliver services to the community. We need to move to a place where we are having the community help us deliver these services, right? They kind of were clearly reaching a point where the government couldn't cater for the needs. So they adopted this asset-based community development approach, which practically meant that, for example, they decided to close down a lot of community centers. Part of the saving they took to reinvest in community organizations that would take over some of the functions of these centers, and were often much closer to the community and much more tailored in the kind of support they could provide. And intentionally, they also moved away from big vendors and long-term fixed contracts into looking for vendors that were open to collaborate with one another, so that they could sit together in weekly neighborhood-based meetings to discuss, what did we learn last week, what worked, what are we doing next week, and have these really flexible contracts that are open book contracts where they could optimize every week to what the community actually needed. So those were the kind of big moves. So there was some clever financial engineering because they were quick. They could still do that. We're now at a point where that becomes less and less feasible. They recognized the mutual aid that is already happening in cities around the world, that everyone is stepping up, and actually began to move money into those that are helping the government. And in the end, I think they would say today, if you enter the doors of the government as a citizen or as someone with an idea to change something, the experience is completely transformed.
Mm-hmm. So I'm fascinated by this case because in many ways it's a very almost like tech-free approach. It's very much based on face-to-face community co-production, right? Like if you go to the Wigan website and watch some of their videos that they've documented this transformation, it's a lot of people sitting around in community centers. There's volunteers, there's NGOs, and I appreciate that. But it makes me wonder, and sort of the history of asset-based community development. You think about like some of the really transformative like urban tech startups of the last few years, like Airbnb and Uber, like they're basically asset utilization plays, right? You're taking idle car seats or idle apartments and putting them on the grid. And is there some overlap here where you can take what has worked in these more like co-production of public service innovations and find a way to bring tech into them in a way that doesn't destroy them, that is empowering? Are they looking for tech to amplify what they're doing, or is tech seen as such a hostile thing that may jeopardize what it is they're trying to do? I'm curious, like what the kind of interaction is there.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
So I think the thing that Wigan has in common with many other cities is that they realize unless they get really, really high quality feedback from the community, it's very, very difficult for them to operate their services. And of course, their priority is the hardest to reach members of the community, the old, and of course, COVID has exposed that more than anything. So, so the idea that you put up a website and people interact with you there is just not going to work. I think larger cities and Barcelona has made a lot of effort in building participatory infrastructure. It is still today very, very hard to really see through whether that's empowered the right people. And I think civic engagement is just this hypersensitive area. But I think one thing that Barcelona did, they won the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge some years ago with this platform to connect elderly people who live alone with their relatives, with the nurses, with the entire community that is connected to them, and help them all coordinate and really work together with that person to kind of combat social isolation. And I think that's been super, super successful. And I think that kind of tool is incredibly powerful. And I think we're seeing some tools in areas like nutrition and so forth around those communities where you actually make technology a permanent presence in their life that provides real meaning. I think on the citizen engagement side, though, I would say that I really love the work that Elucid is doing on citizen sentiment, first in policing and now applied to other areas to kind of collect.
Can you explain that a little bit for people that aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, so Elucid started with the New York City Police to offer them a way to, at beat level, so at very hyper-local level, collect feedback from citizens about their experience of policing. And they did that not by posting surveys, but by embedding polls in Candy Crush and other mobile games. And so they got hyper-local feedback. They knew exactly where people were and where they were residents. And they could ask them these really pointed, immediate, high-interval questions. And they had super precise demographics. They would reach anyone. Anyone plays Candy Crush, it seems. So I think it's a really powerful tool because it proactively finds the people rather than relying on people coming in or finding a website or a portal. And the high interval and high demographic resolution adds just a quality to it that could be so powerful in many environments. And I think in Mexico City, we're embedding, in the procurement of the new public bike system, we're embedding that thinking into how the vendors are going to collect feedback from both users, but also we're looking at ways for collecting feedback from people that don't use the service to find out why they're not using these bikes or what needs they have. So I think there is that space is so important, in anything that kind of helps us understand what people are doing. But we also did a study with Numo, a nonprofit on mobility, and we found that 99% of citizen engagement technology doesn't achieve even the most basic diversity or empowerment functions. So there's also a lot of noise out there, a lot of attempts to do this, and it's tricky, right? It's tricky because people, especially those people we really need to get to, are hard to reach.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about cost savings. But before I do, I just want to remind all of the attendees that if you'd like to submit some questions, we're going to open it up for questions in about 15 minutes. And you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and submit those, and we'll share those with Sascha. So you wrote in the Embracing Austerity blog. Well, there's two topics I want to get into. The first, so assuming we do find a good idea for a tech intervention, what's the right way to get started? Are pilots a good way to introduce tech innovations into a city? Or is there some faster and more flexible way of approaching it that you think is the right way to do it?
So, so if there's one lesson from the UK, it has been that cities are looking for partners who will work with them and optimize every week what they're doing to the needs of their users. And so I think as long as we can stay close to that model, and I think it's a really relevant model. And Anthony, you and I, we once shared a panel called the Bespoke Smart City, right? This question of whether really investors love to hear that we're building a technology and then we're going to scale it to 1 million cities, but cities are evidently asking for a partner who will really, really, really be local. And I think they're willing to also pay a high premium for that. So I think the first question is how can we be really, really close to the changing needs? Because I think cities that know what they're doing are going to be sensitive to your ability to respond to that. Pilots are of course always a good idea. I mean, the more you can show and try before you buy, but pilots are also costly for cities. And I think right now their appetite to just try something and get convinced by a pilot is maybe lower than meeting a compelling partner who says, I'll sit this through with you. I'll be a good partner to you in this really hard time, and we will together solve these problems. And maybe what I have right now isn't right, but we'll get it right by being very close to the people or to the need you have. And I think that's the kind of message that I think is important right now. However, we can link that to the sensors or other things we might want to deploy.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of leads into the other big issue, which you wrote about, which was, I think the sort of budget cuts that are showing up in municipal budgets now, sort of out of nowhere, that are ascribing cost savings to technology that may or may not even exist yet. That certainly, I think, puts urban tech at risk of overselling itself as well. How real of a fear is that? Who's to blame? Is it the tech purveyor, the tech procurer? And how should urban tech respond to that risk?
Yeah, I mean, any change management or reform effort in a live public service is risky, right? And especially at a time where you have no slack money and where your citizens you're serving have no tolerance for failure, right? Where they're so dependent. I mean, cities are going to stop doing things that are not important. So anything we get involved in right now is going to be important to someone. So I think the legitimate concern is that whether you're peddling smart management ideas or whether you're peddling technology, you have to be careful and mindful that you may be putting the beneficiaries of all of this more at risk if this doesn't work out. And things just don't work out most of the time. So, and those cities that are now publishing a 30% department cut saying we're using technology to cut costs are at risk, right? Because they're already taking the money away before they've made the transition, before they've learned if something works, which is the proper way of doing things. I think we have to be cautious in overselling. Now, there is an opportunity here to oversell, and a lot of companies may well do that out of their own urgent needs. But I think if we can be mindful to that, if we can be good partners to this transition, if we can help cities scope and plan that transition, if we can kind of maybe involve some of those experienced change management consultants who have failed 100 times already, but know also what doesn't work. Maybe that's a good time, right, to think about who we need to bring on board, who can help us, rather than selling this perfect scenario of our technology doing all the things it could potentially be doing.
Are there any things that you see people trying to sell into cities right now that you think aren't being sold enough or aren't being picked up enough? Things that you find particularly exciting or productive?
I'll stick to my citizen survey question and collecting really good feedback. I think cities are cutting budgets on that front. Santa Monica cut its well-being index, which was a very important tool for the city to understand how the needs of its most vulnerable people. Mm-hmm. So I think anything that allows cities to stay very, very close to their community needs is a priority. I think beyond that, I think cities are already moving out of a lot of capital spending and a lot of other kind of smart things projects where smart things might be embedded. I think I would always prioritize that the city maintains the capacity to understand sustainability, climate change, water management, and those things over automating those people out of jobs. I think right now we're really at the risk of, and Santa Monica is again another case of that. They closed down all departments to do with the future, sustainability, planning, vision zero, zero waste. All of that has been shut down, which means that the city no longer has any capacity to even know what a good idea looks like. So I think I would be looking, I think urban tech has a good moment there over gov tech, which may just be used to kind of reduce capacity, like human capacity in government.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to start to bring in some questions, first from our team and then from some of the participants. So Michael Similian, director of the Urban Tech Hub, is asking whether there are domain areas such as mobility management, construction, infrastructure, where you see more adoption of innovations in technology or procurement than in others.
Oh yeah, so transport is clearly the outlier. It makes up about 20% of the innovation in procurement, and I think that's we'll see how that behaves. But that's of course been a lot of it has been driven by anticipation of autonomy, of micromobility, and ride sharing and car sharing. I think there is infrastructure was a big area in 2019. I know of countries where infrastructure is being accelerated because no one's on the street. Works are finished much, much faster than in the past, so they can actually push through big projects much faster. I think that's maybe a little bit unpredictable to kind of determine what that is. And then the other area that is moving fast is citizen engagement. 2019 was the year where that went from 0 to make up 3% of all transactions, and I think that's only going to grow. So however that is manifested in technology, but it's certainly an area where governments are looking to innovate and turn things around.
So Paul Salama submitted a question almost the day we announced the event a few weeks ago. And he asked, is it possible to speed up timelines in cities with robust and established procurement and community outreach processes? He's talking about the example, or I guess you talked about the example of San Francisco and Los Angeles continuing their existing congestion pricing processes, but not putting anything on the ground until 2022.
Yeah, I mean, so everything is possible. Procurement is not a thing that is cast in stone. It's made up of people, and most of the delays we're experiencing are collaboration, lags. They're not actually kind of baked into the system that it needs to be slow. I think community engagement is really, really a big problem. So in particular in procurement and planning and everything, because the way cities and also the business community handle it is that they plan a project and then they want to hear from the community. So they create this 2-month window where they want an answer or want community participation. We've known for the past 50 years that meaningful community engagement starts with asking people how they're feeling. What's important to you? What's on your mind? And it can take months until you get to the point where you can talk about electric scooters in a meaningful way, or the way that maybe different modes of transport come together. So I think one way of really unlocking that lag in the timelines is for cities, and maybe in collaboration with the private sector, to invest in all year round community organizing. In my blog series, I refer to User Voice, an organization that works with ex-offenders. There are many, many community organizations in public health and transport and other areas that do community organizing. And if we were cultivating those, we would have a much easier time of getting answers when we need them. But you can't get them on demand. It just doesn't work that way. People don't understand what autonomy might mean to their area, or they don't understand what congestion pricing might mean for them unless you help them work towards that scenario.
Yeah, user voice was another great example. Along with the Wigan plan of these like engagement and co-production models, like almost completely free of any kind of like consumer or citizen engagement technology. And it was so jarring to me to look at those and think, if you were like starting like a takeout business or a delivery business, you would do it completely opposite, right? Like you would engage each person individually through a digital channel. Now, whether the quality of that engagement would be better or worse, it just struck me that they were operating in two totally different universes.
Yeah.
And not touching at all.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a huge gap.
I mean, I think maybe to come back to Barcelona's distributions of thousands of tablets to elderly residents, I think that's a really powerful platform, right? You're beginning to put that infrastructure in place. New York City distributed hundreds of thousands of iPads to students who have no access to technology. And those, I think, are beginning to provide us with more meaningful platforms of engaging communities if we want to. And of course, offenders or people in a prison don't have access to any technology, so you have to reach them manually. But also their needs are incredibly complex, and solving those problems early on have a huge financial and other benefit to society, right? So these are the kind of super users of our services and our infrastructures.
Yeah, it's interesting using technology to reach senior citizens. The Interactive Telecommunications Program at NYU, ITP, was founded in 1973 by Red Burns and Mitchell Moss, who were two professors at NYU, after they had conducted a pilot program at some nursing homes in, I think it was Reading, Pennsylvania, where they had basically built a chat system using like modems and teletype machines for a bunch of senior citizens. So this is like an idea that just keeps coming back and coming back. Some more questions from Mike Bloomberg, not the billionaire Mike Bloomberg. He asks, you mentioned barriers to getting procurement data. Is the barrier to getting better procurement data political or technical? What could governments do to assist?
Yeah, this is so the US is really special there. We found on average that cities have, I believe, 2 procurement platforms. I think San Francisco had at 1.7 procurement portals, which all publish different parts of the city's procurement opportunities. The US is atomized in a way that is almost unsolvable. And I think one of the pieces of work I'm involved in is to see whether we can build a national open source public procurement infrastructure. There's just no other way to fix this anymore. You have a bunch of vendors that are selling these municipal procurement platforms. They're all incompatible. None of them produce open data. They're locked in different ways and different ways of doing things, different patterns, different behaviors. You can't subscribe anywhere to get reliable data. And I don't think municipalities are going to be able to all transition into the right direction. So I think the US is really, really ripe for a disruptive open source platform there. I think to me, that's almost the only way forward. The only other way of getting that data is to do what we did, read everything. That's an effort, but because also then the data that is published, the aggregators that are publishing procurement data will give you the title of a procurement and some commodity codes, of which 30% are wrong. So there's very little you can do with that information.
Is there any opportunity for like aggregating that among a group of cities? I know, there have been a number of efforts among cities to pool procurement for GovTech and other things like that. Have they been successful, or is it just doesn't have the scale?
I don't think that's a big. I mean, it would seem like a big opportunity. It's their cities now have access to some data to see how much others paid for commodity and other items, and they can see each other's contracts. I think there's some mileage in there. History has shown that procurement is usually a step in like either bigger change management processes, especially when it comes to new technology. And those aren't really synchronized across governments. It'd be very, very hard to imagine that like 20 cities in the US would go through procurement reform at the same time to then jointly procure a new portal or something. I think that is really tricky. Now, what cities can do and what cities are doing is they can piggyback on other contracts. So if LA is procuring something, they can indicate to vendors that other cities may draw on the same terms. Mm-hmm. And that means that someone is leading on the specifications. But again, there's very little traction in that space, and it reaps, I would say it reaps small percentage savings in areas where governments could save 20, 50% if they just really change the way they do things. So it may also lead us down the wrong path, in that it becomes so convenient to procure what others are procuring that you're no longer pursuing your own change agenda, but that you're just kind of following the easy way. And that seems to be over and over the case when given the choice.
So a lot of the focus of your work with Citymart over the last 10 years has been to try to sort of flip that procurement process on the head, right? And help cities stop issuing procurements that sort of specified the solution and try to come at it from a more problem-defining approach, so that they would open the funnel wider and get both a more varied set of solutions as well as a more geographically spread set of solutions. Have you had success with that? Has that been able to sort of drive some of these bigger systemic changes that tackle some of the complexity that you talk about? Or have they struggled to get past the transactional kinds of procurements?
No, I think it's much of that starts with a mindset that is defined both by saying, I accept that I don't know everything and that I'm open to new ideas, and a mindset that says I'm willing to work differently to do this, right? So And when you do that, the results we achieved were truly remarkable. I mean, you know, instead of 2 bids for procurement, we averaged 25, which meant that you had a lot more competitive pressure. You had diversity that was almost a mirror of the actual urban society we had, with more than 50% minority and women-owned businesses. Small businesses won practically all contracts we run in 135 cities. So all kinds of amazing things happened, but changing the mindset is hard. And that's where you notice the difference between what happened in the UK, where procurement reform was intentionally started already 16 years ago, saying that we need to give procurement a meaning, a strategy, a direction. We need to make procurement a public service. And in the US, where that hasn't happened, you will not find a procurement office who has much of a vision of where their department will go beyond becoming more automated and maybe more transparent and more efficient. Whereas in the UK, in Liverpool, the procurement department doubles as the innovation department.
Can you go back and fill in? You skipped over explaining the role of the consolidator, I think it was, in the UK procurement system, or there was some term that you used. Coordinator? What?
The commissioner, yeah.
Commissioner, right.
The commissioner. So the UK has a couple of special features that emerged out of this procurement reform that was started years ago. So one part was to say procurement needs to be a valued profession, and every local authority in the country, every municipal government needs to have a procurement strategy that they publish regularly, in which they outline why they're procuring and what the goals are and where they want to take this. And that forced them to kind of address issues like sustainability or technology or innovation or diversity or how this links to other things. So it dragged it out of the clerical back office into the public. In parallel, with support from the central government, the UK adopted an approach called commissioning to designing and managing public services and procuring public services, where you have these, I call them really entrepreneurial public servants whose job it is to oversee the delivery and transformation of public services. So a really good example is the Commissioner for Social Services in Sefton, a pretty poor town outside Liverpool. He was put in charge of decommissioning the city's Meals on Wheels service because it was not a statutory service. The city had no more budget for it and they wanted to cut it down. But he was tasked with it so that he could see if there's a way of moving it off the government's balance sheet, but still delivering food to elderly people. And he did that successfully. And I think that's the kind of role we don't really know in procurement in the US. People who are tasked with maximizing public value and finding ways of doing that, rather than just doing the paperwork of the transaction. And so that's really the secret of what's been driving a lot of the change there.
How do you think that might either say a state or a big city in the U.S. might move down that road? Understanding that I'm going to guess in the U.K. that's probably a civil service position, where in the U.S. it would probably at least initially be like a political appointee type thing, right? So like, how do you give it some sort of stature and authority that isn't just going to be,
Yeah, so these are not at all to be confused with commissioners as we know them in the US, right? So these are project managers. They're relatively junior positions. They tend to be very smart people and they tend to be entrepreneurial in nature, but they come out of the public service, right? They didn't there wasn't a wave of recruitment of new talent into government to fill those positions. So I think but I think it came out of the recognition that we're way past silos, right? When you're cutting local government spending by 50%, you can't afford to have silos and departments who don't collaborate and share resources. So I think it was really made possible by that financial pressure and the pressure to keep services up and running, and a good degree of pride in the civil service to make that work, right? They chose in 2010 in Sefton and in many other places, they chose not to resign themselves to the budget cuts, but to make the best of it. And I think it's easy to underestimate that attitude, right? When you think about how frustrating that must have been, just as your community is in dire need, unemployment is exploding, and then you're forced to cut services.
Yeah. We're going to find out really soon.
Yeah.
I want to just go through a number of questions that have been submitted. Rachel Hout asks, are there existing open source procurement platforms that are best in class?
Yeah, that's tricky. I think if you're interested in that, then Prozoro, the Ukrainian open source procurement platform, is interesting as an example. It's an interesting case study. You can also see how intertwined it is with legal reform, and then I don't think there are local government equivalents, although I know that Code for America built one for Pittsburgh, but it's really just the front end. It's just the kind of user-facing presentation of procurements. But yeah, no, we haven't got real kind of complete comprehensive open source alternatives at local level right now.
Bob Balder, who's the director of Cornell's New York Planning and Architecture program, has asked, given the financial impact to cities like NYC, wouldn't this be a perfect opportunity for tech companies to partner, contract with business improvement districts, which still have funding and a desire to innovate? You have thoughts on that?
Yes. Although I don't know. I mean, when I look out of the window in Brooklyn, I see most businesses closed, so I don't really know where they take their money from. But assuming that there is money there, absolutely. And I think they may also be a good platform for the kind of neighborhood-based approach that Wigan used to kind of coordinate services locally and stay really, really close to the needs of the community.
Andrew Arts asked a couple of questions about the leaders that oversee procurement and public sector technology. In particular, the lack of young leaders or digital natives who also grew up in recessions, and whether that has an impact on the kinds of decisions and processes that you're talking about.
Yeah, so I did a study of reports on procurement reforms by academics, by think tanks, by government and procurement organizations, about 30 of them. And leadership is an important issue. And I think there are 2 or 3 parts around leadership. So what you will find is that the top 5 reform issues on their agenda are about people, skills, and leadership. And so when it comes to people, procurement departments lack employees that can think creatively, have collaboration and problem-solving skills. They also lack what in the UK they call commercial skills, which basically means thinking creatively about or discovering business opportunities where maybe in the past you haven't. So kind of being entrepreneurial in that sense. Leadership is a big issue because procurement departments everywhere are defined by a compliance culture. And I think there's a lot of importance there in leadership. And it's kind of like all connected, right? If you don't create a culture that is more than compliance, you're not going to attract talent. You're not going to really inspire people to step into their greatness or potential. But in the US, procurement departments are supposedly also 30% underfunded, which means also that they lack a lot of they're overworked, they lack a lot of the resources to make time to think creatively. So I think digitally native, yes, people need digital skills, but they also need skills, their lack of skills on sustainability, on understanding climate change and what measures might mitigate this. So really anything related to the future matters. And in the UK, they tend to have specialized category managers. So there tends to be someone who's specialized on technology or someone who's specialized on the built environment. And those guys get more deeply involved in understanding the kind of comprehensive issues that are involved in that. In the US, you might have like kind of stationary buyers or something in bigger cities, but it's not really associated with developing a big foresight capacity also.
There's a couple of related questions asking about talent and skills. Andre Almeida is asking, how do we help city leaders believe more in their current talent and silos that need to be opened up to allow innovation from within when financial resources for procurement are increasingly scarce? So I guess, how sourcing ideas from the existing city workforce.
I love that question, and goes right to the heart of, I've always found it troublesome when people said we need talent in government, we need new people and so forth. I just don't see how in hundreds of thousands of municipalities around the world we're going to just source amazing talent or fresh blood. And probably the people that we have there today were the talent of their day if they've been there for a long time. I mean, cities aren't recruiting bad people. Now, I think there are Wigan, I want to come back to Wigan, but Wigan actually retrained their entire workforce on how to work differently with the community, on not seeing people with needs as problems that need to be solved, but looking at ways to help them develop strengths, how to empower even frontline workers to take decisions when they're confronted with a situation. So I think a lot of this is about giving people the license to move forward, and COVID has been a fabulous showcase on what is possible. But also we're winding all of that down again, right? Bureaucracy is catching up on all these kind of creative solutions we found. So I completely agree. And I would also say that there are, Anthony, this is a pet issue of mine. There are unlimited ideas coming from the outside of government, not just from urban tech innovators like formal businesses, but people who care about their community needs and have found ways to solve them. So I think opening up both those sides of the equation is kind of an almost limitless fountain of creativity.
So Mike Bloomberg also has asked another related question, which I guess has to do with tech savviness. And, is tech savviness a barrier to tech adoption? And is it the municipality's responsibility to retrain the employees? Or is it the technologist's responsibility to make the user experience better and more intuitive? And whether you have any examples of GovTech software that's done a great job, or cities that have done a great job training employees in technology.
So I would say that, one of the hardest things with GovTech or any tech startup tends to be that investors reward like one-trick ponies, right? You're either a tech company or you're not. And we've lived through that ourselves as we transition from providing consulting services to being a tech company. It is very, very difficult to be both things. And yet what cities usually need most is both things. They need technology that augments human behavior, and they need people that can on a bit of a spectrum move between the two worlds. So I would say there are a lot of GovTech products that are really flashy and easy to use. If you look at OpenGov, it looks really sexy. It has had zero impact on government's ability to respond to the budget emergency under COVID. It just makes the spreadsheet easier, right? It is not designed to help government deal with emergency budget planning, which, you know, seems like a useful thing. So, so I think the starting point for me is always, where can you add the biggest value? And if it is, we've really learned this the hard way, that if it involves a phone call to help someone procure better, those 10 minutes are better spent than building a self-service product and hoping that people will learn to use it and use it at the right time. I think changing the way you work is so hard already, and relying purely on a technology product, whether that's easy enough to use or not, I think it's just investing in the wrong part. I think it's kind of picking up people where they are and helping them to do the right thing and take a risk or be courageous for the first time. I've come around to the idea that I'll do that in whatever shape or form. And then when we reach the problem that we have so many people wanting to do it, that we can't handle their phone calls anymore, then that's maybe a good time to think about technology interventions.
We have a question from Sanam Valani, who asks, you mentioned a lot of urban tech companies are focused on the sub 10,000 opportunities in government. These end up becoming pilot programs that often don't scale. How should these companies and their VC investors think about these issues as they figure out product market fit and eventually a profitable business model?
Brilliant question. I think it's a real challenge with expectations on traction, with what numbers need to look like, and I think VCs have become comfortable with subsidizing $10,000 contracts if you can sign up a lot of municipalities, so that then your sales infrastructure can sustain a bunch of other products that are also priced below $10,000. So I think that is one answer, and it's not a good answer, and it's not pretty, and it doesn't give us the kind of services we want. I mean, municipalities are dealing with problems, and urban tech has the opportunity to deal with problems that add millions and billions of dollars of value. There really is no reason to be stuck with this $10,000 conversation. Now, I would like to see VCs, you know, on a roadshow, meeting mayors and kind of helping them work that out, right? You know, VCs you know, generally think that startups are better than government, and I think there's a lot of room there to kind of open the conversation and find meaningful ways. But that also can't just be saying that my startup doesn't sell enough to you and you need to make it easier, but needs to also be an appreciation of, especially right now, the hardships these communities are facing.
Okay, we have a few more questions here. Let's see. Have you investigated? Okay, so Diana Allegretti asks, we're talking about cities and towns, but the US is totally based on the state system. Have you investigated the optional New York State procurement portal that local governments may use? You familiar with that?
I haven't investigated it. I know it's vendors that are certified on New York State's procurement books are easier for New York City to use, for example. Mm-hmm. And that makes things a lot more convenient and quicker. The thing is, a lot of really, really cool urban tech vendors don't know that they could be registered with the state and benefit from that. Mm-hmm. I think there's another really, really big and complicated issues around MWBE certification and the benefits in cities like New York City you can get from that, but how in other regions that is not appreciated or not valued in the same way, and how those regulations aren't really thought through to the journey of a tech startup. So you actually get kicked out of certification once you reach a certain business success, and then you're actually kicked out of your your contracts that help you to establish your business in the first place. So that's a kind of challenge also, that governments rarely have really thought through so I would say the first thing, governments have rarely had a conversation about what kind of vendor ecosystem would we love to have. Who would we love to do business with? What would they look like? What would they do with us? How flexible would they be? What values would they have? That needs to happen. And then we need to look at, how do we design a journey that these guys can start with a small contract and grow into becoming, the big vendor one day with us if they're doing well. And that question we haven't answered, what that journey looks like, and really tailored, especially to the needs of tech startups, right? Who kind of have a very unusual path of growing and a different way of working. If you sign a contract with New York City that involves any technology, I mean, you're giving away your soul and your company with that contract. If the city ever decided to enforce anything written in that contract, there's no chance that you can fulfill all of that. So I think just the prioritizing this as an issue, saying, and I think this is changing now. More and more cities are coming to us saying, what should it look like? Who should I want to do business with? And I think Wigan again has some clues there, because the city decided to award contracts to companies or organizations that share the values of the city, that are local, that have a proven interface and relationship with residents, but that also want to collaborate with one another, that are open to not seeing everyone else as a competitor, but actually saying, we together are operating this community. And are willing to work under flexible arrangements. I think cities need to lead on that front. They need to tell us what we can do to be good citizens. And right now they're telling us you're a good citizen if you have a huge balance sheet, huge liability insurance, and some guys who've spent their life selling to government.
So we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to close by asking you to share your thoughts on sort of what you're watching and where the hotspots are, and the questions on the top of your mind, as we go into what's likely to be a very, very challenging winter, particularly in the United States, but also globally for cities. Second wave of COVID, a lot of bond interest payments coming due, service cuts. A lot of scared people, and elections, of course. What are the early warning signs? What are the places where we might see some signs of hope? And what are your plans for reporting and thinking about all this?
So I'm really right now trying to get cities to understand that when they say mutual aid has been great in my community, how they can turn that into how they can use their budget and what remains of their budget to strengthen that, and to make their city more resilient by strengthening the organizations that are able to step up when the city can't deliver. I think another thing I'm really interested in is over the past year, I've been working with NUMO on market entry for urban mobility technologies. And Anthony, you've been kind of an advisor to this project, but I think we're really charting out a course of how you can put the community first and build urban tech deployment around community engagement. And I hope that our report and our playbook goes live in hopefully the coming weeks. But I think that's a really interesting resource also, because we did a lot of research on evaluating civic engagement methodologies and tools. I'm also really, I worry that we're cutting away our capacity to listen to our communities, and that we're at risk also by not being able to physically meet that we're at risk of relying on third-hand information, or that governments are beginning to rely more and more on these kind of proxy data sets they get from OpenTable or something. And I think that's really disconcerting, because that's how cities make policies, and that's how they take decisions, by trying to figure out what is going on outside. So I don't know how that's going to play out, but it gives me worry if we overlook that. And then, yeah, there's all the budget disaster that's going to hit us, and I think that's just in the US. I think it's going to be everyone fends for themselves, and it's going to be really, really messy, with some getting it right. Like DC did they had a kind of recession budget scenario last year when they prepared their budget plan, which is pretty much exactly what's happening right now. So they at least had thought through what that could look like. Santa Monica had nothing of that sort, and has basically given away its future for years to come.
Yeah, I think that last point about proxy data sets is really, really important for urban tech, because it's easy for us to look at what we have and say, oh, well, we have this relevant data, rather than to think, well, can we design the data gathering apparatus to go out and really generate the new data that's needed to address the problem, which may be a more costly or challenging endeavor, but it's what's needed. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I know it's extremely late in Spain, which means it's time for you to go out and have dinner. But I appreciate you staying up and sharing all your insights with us. We're going to be making the video available for others, and we'll share that around. I just want to throw up a slide real quick to share some coordinates. The replay and a transcript of all this will be available, as well as the updated calendar for the rest of the series at urbantech.network. If you're interested in reading Sascha's Embracing Austerity blog, it's available at medium.com/embracingausterity. And our next event, which will be a joint seminar with Cornell Tech's Digital Life Initiative, is called The Platform Insurgency: Does Urban Tech Have an Ethics Problem? And that will be a little bit of a different format. We'll have a panel discussion with a handful of invited experts from a variety of walks of life to help us dig into a white paper that I'll be sharing that lays out some tentative definitions and open ethical questions around where urban tech has come from and where it might be headed in the future. So with that, we'll bring the meeting to an end, and thank everyone once again for coming. And feel free to share any thoughts, reactions, impressions, follow-up questions with us. You can reach us through the website. I'm very easy to find on the internet, social media, Anthony Mobile. And thank you once again.